Data garnered by scientific inquiry abounds with evidence for idealism, the philosophical view that reality is entirely mental, or that consciousness is the ultimate reality. I've already said previously that between materialism and idealism, if one is to be the default position, it is the latter, not the former. One cannot infer metaphysics from science, but we can certainly deduce from empirical evidence which worldview dovetails best with observations. Science is there to mainly predict how nature will behave, not what it is in and of itself. No empirical evidence could ever prove materialism because what is observed, like the mathematics that describes the world, exists necessarily in mind. Kant once stated that we can never know the noumenal world because all we perceive is phenomenal. Schopenhauer responded by saying that we should study nature from ourselves, not study ourselves from nature as materialism tries to do. Kant was also wrong about not having access to noumena due to his illogical inversion. The noumenon is what we are and we can access it, or apprehend it, through introspection. The noumenon is consciousness, that which undeniably exists. What we assume to be a world separate from mind and devoid of consciousness is actually an appearance in mind and phenomenal. To assume that there is a world outside of mind is an abstraction that isn't backed by any concrete evidence. Materialism is, thus, untenable. On the other hand, mind as the ultimate medium of reality and the existence of something immaterial, like consciousness, is backed by evidence and patently obvious from first-hand experience to anyone who pays careful attention to it. None of the arguments for idealism deny what reality is like. All the laws of physics, or the way nature behaves with its effects, are taken into account. For instance, when me, Claudia Soprano of the Non-Physical, and Dr. Michael S. Lee were discussing potentially new techniques for visualization, we discussed how sensitive to eye rubbing some people are and how corneas can easily be damaged. I pointed out that there was a guy in the newspaper who messed up his vision because he was in the habit of resting his head in his hands where the edge of his palms would dig into his eyes. Slowly but surely, it changed the shape of his eyeballs, which the optician picked up on. We were discussing the technique of image streaming and decided that it was fine minus the eye rubbing. It's also fine to work with after images from bright objects or light sources. We don't need phosphenes caused by cornea stimulation. As you can see, idealism still recognizes reality dynamics and urges caution, whilst recognizing that the physicalist paradigm begets the mind-body problem, or the hard problem of consciousness. The two best theories of consciousness, according to the scientific community, are lacking, as a list of predictions wasn't met by the results of a number of experiments involving different types of brain scan as they looked at certain aspects of consciousness. Several experts got together for a number of experiments, the first of which involved participants being shown a series of pictures and symbols and asked to report on their appearance. According to Tononi's integrated information theory, sustained activation in the back of the brain should have been observed throughout, as suggested by the data. However, there was only transient synchronization of activity between brain areas in the posterior cortex, not the sustained synchronization that was hypothesized, something which was highlighted in a Nature article. Global neuronal workspace theory, on the other hand, predicted that the prefrontal cortex should be activated during the task, which was confirmed, but no evidence was found that this brain region contained information about object orientation, which was part of the subjective experience of the participants and expected according to GNWT. There was indeed evidence of global broadcasting, but only at the initial stages of an experience, which contradicted the prediction that it should also be observed at the end. All of this makes clear what Bernardo Kastrup pointed out. When we look at brain activity, we only see a partial imprint of mental activity, not the subjective experience of the individual whose brain is being measured. It's like looking at footprints and materialists assuming that that is what walking looks like. Kastrup said it best, and I quote, "A neural process is an image, but the image is not the phenomenon it represents. The image is just how the phenomenon appears when observed from a second-person vantage point." In his water analogy, as human beings, we are whirlpools in a stream where some information comes in and some is ejected away from the spiral, just like the flow of water molecules. We may see the whirlpool as a separate object from the rest of the water that surrounds it, but ultimately, it's all water, it's all mind. The entire universe, including the avatars of conscious observers, would be a spatio-temporal illusion made of qualia, or experiences in mind. Ultimately, there is only mind. Even in those rare occasions when we experience a naked awareness, it is the qualia of awareness itself. Through metacognition, consciousness can observe itself and realize its formless nature divorced from conceptual reality, which is composed of the forms that the mind can adopt, or, in other words, the contents of consciousness. Kastrup makes a distinction between a personal or egoic mind and what this one is aware of as localized, constrained consciousness, and the larger mind, which makes up what he takes to be the equivalent of Jung's collective unconscious, accessible when the whirlpool, as it were, is disrupted, or when we shuffle off our mortal coil. Most people perceive a world out there and then meaningfully separate themselves, as the observer, from what is observed. We are all guilty of doing this. It's a persistent habit. It's venial because the illusion is strong. There are many examples of people creating distinctions in their minds and believing them to be true. The funny thing about the mind is that it often tries to understand things by what they are not, itself included. It is true that we are not the contents of consciousness, consciousness being what we are, but since those contents are appearances in consciousness, in essence, consciousness adopting forms from its formless nature, then the contents, which are illusions, are a part of it. It bears repeating, ultimately there is only consciousness, and monism is true. Now, even though I find Bernardo Kastrup laudable and a great thinker when it comes to his analytical idealism, I don't necessarily agree with everything he says, especially regarding some of the assumptions he makes about universal consciousness or mind at large. There is a clip where Kastrup says that universal mind is unlikely to be metacognitive. This supposition is a mistake that only creates a new problem, albeit not as hard, as they say, as the hard problem of consciousness in a materialist context. No observations of the physical world, which to Kastrup is like a dashboard in an aeroplane cockpit, could ever fully inform one of the dynamics of the broader mind, which is analogous to the sky outside the aeroplane. The dashboard, by the way, entails space-time, including Darwinian evolution. We cannot intuit the capacity or limits of mind at large from the experience of limited personal minds as conscious observers within a space-time construct, with natural restrictions, such as our universe with its laws of physics. Just like the pilots playing with the dashboard inside a cockpit cannot fathom, atmospheric dynamics outside the plane by looking at buttons and levers. Also, the human mind is a part of the universal mind, so it stands to reason that if it's a localized, restricted perspective, it shouldn't be capable of much more than the mind at large. Furthermore, my experience contradicts what Kastrup suggested. When I experienced naked awareness during one of my meditative forays, that pure awareness divorced from thoughts and conceptual reality couldn't help but be conscious of itself, because it is in its nature to be the ultimate witness. If there is nothing else but itself, that's where it will focus. It shines a light on itself, as it were. This is metacognition. This happened when I somehow managed to get rid of all the mental noise of conceptual reality. I believe Kastrup got it backwards about metacognition. It is the universal consciousness that is capable of all possible states of mind, including metacognition. The human mind, on the other hand, can occasionally tap into them because it is mostly restricted to this space-time reality construct. Kastrup's main mistake in his analytical idealism is to forget that evolution doesn't explain metacognition if we say that only modern humans are capable of such compared to, say, Homo erectus. His view in assuming that evolution is what leads to metacognition almost mirrors the materialist view that we, as a species, went from Homo sapiens to becoming Homo sapiens sapiens, man that knows he knows, without even explaining how matter creates and influences the mind. So one cannot have it both ways when dealing with metaphysics. Either matter somehow magically generates consciousness, and this one starts to mind more and more things in its field of awareness as evolution progresses, or the process of evolution in mind filters through more of its scope incrementally across time, in which case mind at large already possesses infinite potential, including the ability to be metacognizant. You can also feel like a different person in your dreams because sometimes you don't remember waking life, or you can even experience false memory syndrome. I would also add that from my own experience, I have taken psychedelics and I have felt like my mind was altered to the point where I wasn't even human anymore, and yet, in terms of consciousness, it was still me. But the most profound experience was the one I touched upon before, where I was aiming for lucid dreaming from a maintained awareness point and ended up getting somewhere else. All qualia had disappeared save for the experience of awareness itself. Words can never do it justice. All thoughts and memories were gone. My earthly identity was gone. And I was in a state far divorced from conceptual reality. It was a blissful stillness. Nothing weighed on me, like I was a luminous witness or a radiant emptiness. It was pure consciousness, and it was clear. There was nothing to be aware of but itself, so definitely metacognitive, and something about it was both revelatory and unfathomable because there were no words to describe it and nothing to refer to it. I wasn't human. I wasn't anything but unperturbed consciousness. Even the concepts of time and space were gone. I could stay there forever. Then, as soon as the thoughts came, the stillness and bliss were gone. The first subsequent thoughts were along the lines of, "What is this? Where am I? Who am I?" And they paved the way for a narrative that would attempt to formulate answers and describe what was experienced. I became human again, as though I needed to do so in order to attempt to map out that state. I needed to become something else in order to do it. The narrative of that pristine cognition is what you get from me, which somehow doesn't do it justice. Maybe that's why I keep trying to describe it. But an insight remained. I know I didn't really become something else. At my core, I am precisely that formless, empty consciousness which transcends all conceptual reality. It's empty, yet capable of embodying entire worlds. It can be filled with everything imaginable. There was a radiant quality to it, like it had a creative principle. I speak about it as though it's separate from me, but it is, in fact, the real me, or perhaps the pure me. I am just disassociated from such a pure state now because I identify as being this human being living this life. I don't know about the mind at large. Perhaps we can only truly appreciate it once we have shuffled off our mortal coil. But what I experienced could definitely qualify as primordial consciousness or the ground of being. But I have no idea what Kastrup means when he states that mind at large is phenomenal and incapable of metacognition. It is important to also make the distinction that the contents of consciousness are not conscious. They are just features of mind, including our bodies. After all, I am conscious of my body parts, but the body parts are not conscious of themselves as far as I'm aware. To say the universe is conscious is to adopt panpsychism, a proposition I reject. I think the universe is one massive illusion in mind. In other words, we are not in the universe, but the appearance of one exists in our field of awareness. If we are essentially consciousness and thus the ground of being, then it is the universe that exists in us as a mental process. We should regard the distinction between observer and observed as valid, even in a non-physicalist monist context, where mind is the only medium. After all, sometimes what is observed isn't conscious, such as an inanimate object, in which case it is an appearance in mind, a mental definition or a phenomenal construct in the field of awareness. Another problem which has been discussed ad nauseum by both metaphysical camps, materialism and idealism, is free will. In my days as a physicalist, I was sure that hard determinism was true because it seemed to me to be the logical conclusion in a cause and effect universe where only atoms exist. But I can no longer commit to any belief about what is really going on. I am still inclined to think that, at least from an anthropic position, we make decisions based on urges and impulses that we are not responsible for ab initio, as their origins seem to me to be an absolute mystery. But I also think that my friend Claudia Soprano makes a good point. It might be hasty to conclude that free will definitely doesn't exist if we can't even depict or imagine what free will would look like if the present reality doesn't qualify. Maybe, and just maybe, libertarian free will is an absolute impossibility or perhaps unfalsifiable. I'm not going to commit to anything with certainty because I'm not sure. If we imagine a vantage point going beyond 4 dimensions, then this space-time construct is already set and the arrow of time is an illusion, in which case it would make any conscious observer within that system identify with the unfolding of events and experience the illusion of free will. On the other hand, if we are also the mind at large, the Brahman, not just the Atman, if we are the universal consciousness before we became human, and the larger mind is responsible for conceptual reality, including the mental features of space and time in all possible reality constructs, then there is an exploratory intentionality there, an unconstrained by any laws, since laws or restrictions are also its ideas, and such freedom to simultaneously explore an infinitude of scenarios would confer free will as an essential feature of the broader mind. On the other hand, perhaps the mind at large can't help but explore itself from different perspectives and adopting different forms involving mathematics, geometries, multiple dimensions, worlds with sentient beings and other quirks of existence, all out of its formless nature. And if that's the case, if it's driven by a natural compulsion, it's not free. But then again, it can tell itself narratives where it is portrayed as meaningfully free, and also narratives where it has to follow rules it couldn't help but dream up. Just like humans can reframe their experiences to decide whether they are positive, negative, or neutral, like seeing the bright side of a bad situation or vice versa. I also suspect that meaning arises from how certain concepts or ideas relate. Perhaps being free or being constrained are ideas that have no intrinsic reality other than seemingly gaining essence in conceptual formulations, which include our illusory universe. For instance, if you reach a naked awareness undaunted and undisturbed by thoughts or concepts, and then you return to your human being mode to look at it in hindsight, you might decide that you were free of everything and free to contemplate your true nature in a process of undisturbed metacognition. But after you describe your experience to someone with your positive spin, where you felt free during that blissful state, someone might tell you that it all sounds dreadful, that you, in fact, were deprived of freely experiencing the familiar stream of thoughts characteristic of humans, that you were deprived of memories and deprived of even the concept of decision-making that comes with rich contexts that were absent in the so-called virtue of clear consciousness. This would be a negative spin on conceptualizing a description of the experience and what it means, or what people think it should mean, or how it should be taken. Such a negative spin makes it seem like freedom was absent because it is also a concept, and yet the experience itself was somehow luminous, revelatory, and blissful. I get irritated with the way certain words mean certain things to different people, which is why, when engaging in discussions or debates about free will, or any subject for that matter, one has to get acquainted with philosophical and scientific lingo, and the latter isn't always the best. For example, in discussions about free will, we have to know what libertarianism, compatibilism, and hard determinism are, and we must differentiate between them. The claim that there is no self, or that self is an illusion, also seems to get a lot of people riled up. I can understand the claim when it's taken to mean that the self refers to human identity or even personality. After all, people can forget who they are when they develop acute amnesia, and often, in the process of recovering memories, they make new ones, try different things they never did before, and develop new idiosyncrasies. In the state of pure awareness I described before, I had no notion of being human, let alone remember my name. In Buddhism, it is called anatta, the no-self state. But people sometimes use self with a capital S to mean the core of what they are, consciousness, the essence of what you are, which remains even when you forget your name or identity. In which case, the self is real and not an illusion. The self with a small s, however, is as illusory as money as a concept. If we didn't assign value to paper and nuggets of metal, Currency would cease to exist. Concepts exist in mind, the only reality, ultimately speaking. The word real also has multiple applications. If someone tells me that they don't care if the world is an illusion, that it's real enough to them, never mind its ontology or the metaphysics behind it, who am I to oppose them? It's real enough to them. The Matrix was real enough to cipher, full stop. To me, the only certainty is consciousness. It's formless and yet it's real, even when separate from conceptual reality, like the state of pristine cognition I keep referring to. I would, in all honesty, describe it as my slate being wiped clean. All that remained was consciousness. That's what I was. Pure, clear consciousness, and it seemed to have this luminous quality, but not like light. It's almost indescribable. It was also blissful, like a pure happiness, true happiness. The more I try to describe it, the more it seems like I become detached from it. I am trying to describe it from the point of identifying with so many thoughts and concepts. My descriptions are like ripples, but what I felt was not ripples. It was more like a still lake. I never ceased to be a witness, the witness that never changes no matter what you dream about. Sometimes, in dreams, you forget waking life and can even believe that you are someone else. Sometimes you even have false memories in dreams. Sometimes you can even believe that you are still in primary school as a little boy or girl. You can believe many things about yourself. You can indeed tell yourself many porkies, and yet the part of you that remains the same is that witness, full of potential to identify with anything it perceives. The witness. That to me is the true self, if the word self is to be used. The witness is real. It can never be an illusion. Consciousness cannot be an illusion. I'm only speaking from my experience. I'm not always sure what others mean when they talk about mind at large or oneness. I have a vague idea when philosophers postulate such concepts. Although one thing is apparent, Bernardo Kastrup has articulated an argument which destroys materialism, even if I don't fully resonate with some aspects of his analytical idealism. Despite heightened activity in the prefrontal cortical areas of the brain during lucid dreaming, the brain is not as active as it is during wakefulness, and yet qualia in such paradoxical states during sleep have the potential to outdo those of waking life. Dreams can exhibit a hyperreal quality not found in waking perception unless one takes psychedelics. This would suggest that we can potentially be privy to much more from a larger mind when there is a disconnect from the physical world as noise in the brain, so to speak, decreases. This is ostensible evidence for the filtration theory and supports idealism. It is, to me, the most direct and accessible evidence for a broader mind, far richer perhaps beyond our wildest dreams. I don't really have much to say about free will in the context of idealism. I simply don't know how far freedom can go other than some idea, conceptually speaking. My friend Claudio seems to be much more sure about free will than me. I think it's important to familiarize oneself with the relevant nomenclature before engaging. As I have gathered, compatibilism is soft determinism. Compatibilism states that libertarian free will doesn't exist, but that our agency is such that we should take responsibility for it because it's coming from our very nature. even if, ultimately, we didn't author our ontology. They also believe that even if the will isn't free, the illusion of freedom is too important to discard, and fear that the adoption of hard determinism would collapse society. Matt Dillahunty and Daniel Dennett take this view. The philosopher David Hume took this view. The notion that hard determinism would threaten civilization seems pessimistic to me. If we discovered that the world is truly predetermined, then it might actually make us less judgmental if ultimately we are not responsible for how we feel, let alone our impulsive actions. After all, many of us struggle to break bad habits or unfavorable patterns of behavior. Immanuel Kant and Arthur Schopenhauer opposed compatibilism, and the latter philosopher once said, "Man can do what he wills, but man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills." Schopenhauer opposed compatibilism towards hard determinism, a position also adopted by David Caruso and Sam Harris, who once said that even if there is a soul, it doesn't prove free will because authorship of one's emergent thoughts, emotions, and urges is an absolute mystery. Both camps, compatibilists and hard determinists, deny libertarianism, the view that people have absolute free will. It is clear that under materialism, the libertarian encounters an impasse when attempting to reconcile with Benjamin Libet's experiments where motor cortical regions of the brain fired up at around 300 milliseconds before subjects reported having become aware of the decision to press a button. Other similar experiments also seemed to show that one's personal consciousness is the last to know, according to classical observations, and once it knows, as a witness, it tends to claim authorship of decision-making, akin to a supermarket claiming authorship of a fair trade product by branding it with its logo. It is worth bearing in mind what Sam Harris pointed out in his free will thesis. Even if it were the case that the awareness of decision-making and brain activity occurred simultaneously, it still would not prove free will because we would still be at a loss to explain the source and would also have to take into account the domino process of cause and effect since the Big Bang, involving all the atoms which make up the universe, including our bodies and brains. There just seems to be so much uncertainty and an ostensible unfalsifiability even through the lens of idealism. I fear that all philosophers get caught up in the language describing these phenomena, and free will's existence or non-existence could be relative, depending on perspective. For example, and I'm going to use the Vedic terms here, Atman and Brahman for simplicity. The Atman could perceive having free will, but upon scientific examination might decide it's an illusion or even an absurd assumption in a cause and effect world. But Brahman, of which we are a part, since we are, according to this view, holarchically both, could have absolute freedom to create representations in mind, worlds, sentient beings, etc. But then again, upon examination, we could intuit that it is in its nature to create everything possible or imaginable because it can't help but get away from its primordial self in a multitude of forms. Or it's not free from itself, nor its creative principle. Whatever the case, I am not too bothered. If determinism is ultimately the case, it isn't fatalism. We may not be able to see the future, but we can learn from the past, so it still feels like we can do something about it, and we certainly shouldn't stop trying. There are so many possibilities, so much wiggle room for us to happily make decisions to our heart's content, even if we might come to regret some of them. It's worth mentioning that Libet himself didn't think his experiments ruled out free will because he thought it was apparent that even though cortical activity preceded awareness of decision making, the subject still had the power to veto it just before the moment of physical action, within the temporal space of a millisecond. However, Sam Harris and Max Velmans pointed out that we simply don't know whether or not the vetoing, or free won't, as Libet put it, was included in the unconscious processing of the brain prior to awareness, so the experiment cannot falsify it either way. These observations, of course, were made through the lens of materialism, but because idealism is gaining traction, the waters regarding the free will debate have been muddied. Now determinism isn't so certain, especially if physical elements have no real causal power locally and something else is feeding reality. Is it intentional, or is it simply a sea of infinite possibilities reified because because it couldn't happen any other way? The trouble with free will as a concept is also how narrow or how loosely it can be defined. If you are a human being who wishes to fly like a bird, you will quickly realize you are not free to do so. It's not your fault that you are a human being and not a bird. If you are content with the limitations or conditions of being human, then the anthropic wiggle room to act and decide what to do might be deemed free enough. So here's a question. If you have wishes that cannot be fulfilled and this aggravates you because you cannot will them into being due to restrictions, can you be said to have free will? Your answer to this question depends on how you define the subject discussed. Some people will deem freedom of will inseparable from a world devoid of conditions, especially when the past can influence your present attitude. Others will deem the will free enough as we sense that we choose what we want in the moment despite the constraints of reality. I do think Claudia Soprano disagrees with Bernardo Kastrup more on semantics than anything else when it comes to free will. I'm not saying there aren't any contrasting beliefs between the two beyond semantics, and I certainly wouldn't want to misrepresent either of them, and my friend can correct me if I get anything wrong here, but I think he more or less defines free will in these terms: the subjective freedom experienced when one decides between available choices, given worldly parameters, present conditions and inclinations. Kastrup, on the other hand, attacks the notion of libertarian free will by proffering that authorship of felt sensations, thoughts, emotions and original decision making free from constraints is impossible. From an anthropic perspective, with careful consideration, this type of free will is absurd. You are not free to do whatever you like in the game of life. You might wish to kill a character in the moment, but if this contradicts your wish to play the game in harmony, free of the repercussions that would surely follow murder, and the latter overrides the former, then you are merely being pulled from pillar to post. It's like a game of chess. You are free to make any move you like within the rules, but you are not free to just randomly move with no rhyme or reason if the goal to win is paramount. The way your opponent moves also influences and indeed determines what your play is going to be. A change of plans is contingent on the way the interplay unfolds. Things, however, aren't quite like a game of chess in real life. The analogy can only take you so far. The quantum level of our reality casts uncertainty on everything. Evidence now contradicts superdeterminism and could salvage free will in a seemingly deterministic world. A study was published in Nature back in 2018 before John Clauser et al. Won the Nobel Prize in 2022 for demonstrating that local realism is false, showing results already highly suggestive against superdeterminism. Moreover, this Bell test collaboration used thousands of human subjects, assuming people have free will, to make binary choices over a period of time. One might also assume that meditation and lucid dreaming is evidence of free will, but we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. Lucidity in dreams isn't always guaranteed when we make preparations to increase our chances of critical thinking and mindfulness in dreams. Meditation can also be tricky. The choice to observe your thoughts emerge and fall away without getting sucked into them or falling prey to rumination is a choice like any other. But we don't know where this choice really comes from or what's influenced it. In meditation, you are still acting within constraints and out of a wish or compulsion to meditate, especially when it can be hard to break the default mode of monkey mind for many people. I don't see how mental exercises like meditation and lucid dreaming prove free will. One can still say that the impulse to meditate and how well you do it doesn't evidence absolute freedom, as you still can't tell if you would be able to do otherwise if the universe was rewound to a point in the past before your mind was introduced to the concept of meditation. If we figure out how to view this universe from a dimensional vantage point beyond the 4 dimensions we experience, and we discover that we are living in a spatio-temporal construct that is already set as a static geometrical shape including past, present and future frames floating in Hilbert space, it will not only mean that our temporal arrow is an illusion experienced from within, but it will also mean that free will is an illusion. This is why I'm not being hasty with this subject. I am reluctant to jump the gun. After all, so far, we make observations and conclusions from a very restricted and narrow perspective. Like I said before, the only thing I'm 100% sure of is that consciousness is real. I have also shied away from embracing teleology, especially when we have evidence that eons ago dinosaurs were wiped out willy-nilly, as you can see from the picture on display, and the plausibility that life forms throughout the universe are getting annihilated by cosmic rocks and supernovae as we speak, and that some alien civilizations get destroyed before they get started technologically, goes against the notion of any sort of intelligent plan in the mind of God or some teleological overmind. For those of you who intuitively are inclined to defend libertarian free will, it might be a good idea to really understand the opposition and even attempt to steelman their argument in order to see if one is truly justified in one's convictions. Compatibilists and hard determinists don't equate the absence of free will with fatalism. For compatibilists especially, a puppet is happy as long as it loves its strings. A materialist and a hard determinist would tell you that everything is absolutely predetermined from the Big Bang. Therefore, there is no such thing as free will. But just because this is the case doesn't mean that you should remain in bed and not do anything. In fact, pretty soon, forces beyond your control will urge you to move, such as using the loo, for instance. Determinism is not the same as fatalism. We are, after all, in a position where we can remember the past, mostly, but don't know the future beyond attempts to predict it. Herein lies the illusion of free will to the determinist. They won't be protesting about living in a world of cause and effect because they have hindsight and can derive lessons from the past in order to attempt to influence the future. To stay in bed forever and not do anything is also a choice that can be predicted to beget unfavourable results. So to try to not make decisions is ultimately a choice. To protest is another choice. If you aim to be happy, and I think most people do, you have no choice but to try to influence the future. In the context of materialism, you have the prevalent theory that the brain is a Bayesian machine making statistical predictions all the time based on sensory input. We don't have all the information about the universe available to us, nor do we have absolute certainty about which course of action guarantees well-being and survival. From a number of choices available to us and based on what comes to mind, we take a course of action. That's as free as we are ever going to feel. It's not the same as being coerced by unknown forces against your will. This would be fatalistic slavery. The will feels free as long as the subject is happy to take an action. As a species, we can't even agree on ontic statements about reality, let alone how true it is that we truly have freedom of choice. It could be the case that we are all being hypnotized to behave in certain ways by an overmind or even a mortal master manipulator using electromagnetic signals to influence minds across the globe. We simply don't know, so this is the last thing I'm going to say on the subject of free will, and this will be a pushback against the certainty that liberum arbitrium is a reality, as expressed by Claudia Soprano and the philosopher Richard Oxenberg, whom I respect, by the way, for making eloquent arguments. On the surface, Oxenberg seems to make an excellent point against determinism by stating his reasons why he thinks it makes no logical sense, and I will quote him verbatim. He says, "If every action must be determined by a prior action, and nothing has the power to act in itself, then there can be nothing to initiate all the actions. But if there is nothing to initiate action, there can be no action. So the notion of a closed system of acting things, each of which acts only because it is acted upon by some prior thing, is an incoherent idea. In order for there to be action at all, there must be something that initiates action without being determined or caused." And this is what we mean by, indeed, what we experience as free will. Unquote. I did tell Oxenberg it was eloquently put, but that it still doesn't necessarily rule out determinism unless he can expound upon his reasons based on my counter-argument. And indeed, there's a video coming out with him and my friend Claudia Soprano. I agree with his logic. Unless we postulate a prime mover, a cause and effect process makes no sense in a closed system. But what to make then of the assertions made by the likes of Professor Lawrence Krauss and Nick Holt? They observe that at the quantum level, a state of nothingness is highly improbable as to be regarded as impossible by human beings experiencing a classical reality. Holt's theory can be summarized as such. In the beginning, there were no laws of physics. Laws in physics are pretty much restrictions. If there were no laws, there were no restrictions. Thus everything was permitted and universes emerged from quantum fluctuations because the probability for something to arise is immensely high. This is cosmology's most recent and tentative answer to the question of why there is something rather than nothing. Those initial fluctuations would involve superpositions and vibrations that would lead to emergent properties of wave particles whose interaction becomes more restricted, and hence the laws of physics in a chain of events that define a cause and effect cosmos. And since our bodies are a product of that predetermined chain, there is no free will, unless, of course, the unfolding of the cosmic wave function since the Big Bang was intended by a godly mind, of which we are a part, in which case, not knowing the mereological relationship between Brahman, the ground of existence, and Atman, the individuated observers, other than being intrinsically the same as a pure witness, free will becomes a matter of perspective. The universal mind might have the freedom to create worlds, or it can't help but explore possibilities due to an impulse or urge towards omniscience, and forever create an infinitude of scenarios and narratives. Maybe Brahman created the game of chess, as it were, and then it explores the myriad possibilities of how it can be played using the pieces. Some pieces are more restricted than others according to the rules. The pawn, for example, is inferior to the queen in what it can do, but they all aim to survive and win the game for their side. This could be analogous to Darwinian evolution, which involves a game of adaptation and survival through acquired behaviours in the spirit of species, competition, synergies, symbioses, and other drives. Perhaps, ultimately, it is only the medium of mind exploring itself and realizing it has infinite potential, or consciousness trying to get away from itself by creating illusions of what it's not. Or maybe the primordial consciousness is merely a witness to an uncontrollable monkey mind. Oxenberg's arguments for free will are well constructed, but unconvincing given the uncertainty conveyed by what I've just pointed out. There are many ifs and maybes. I get the feeling that Oxenberg fails to fully represent the opposing argument to free will in the context of idealism. For example, contrary to what Oxenberg claims is required for idealistic determinism, we are not necessarily beholden to a puppet master. Indeed, there are multiple witnesses to what is unfolding before us, and these witnesses are wrapped around their personalities and foibles, but all of them have one thing in common: consciousness itself. At their core, they are a pure witness, because consciousness is what they are. So their earthly identity, which many call the self or ego, is ultimately an illusion. On a more fundamental level, all observers are the same. This is monism taken to its logical conclusion. Just like metal and wood are the same on a subatomic level, both materials are the same energy, just arranged differently. Finally, on a point Oxenberg made in defense of free will, where he questions why we should agonize over our choices when they are predetermined, I have the following response. The answer comes from the realization that determinism isn't fatalism, since if we grant the argument of hard determinists, we often behave on the assumption of libertarian free will, or its illusion, an illusion born out of the fact that within a cause and effect universe we can recall and learn from the past, but we often have to guess the future based on what is presently unfolding. We are not being controlled by a puppeteer against our wishes or against our will, as Oxenberg admits that such is not our experience. If such were the case, it would be fatalistic slavery, but our experience is commensurate with the notion that the puppets are happy as long as they love their strings. We follow our urges, our impulses, and in hindsight sometimes we wish we hadn't behaved so impulsively. We often need time to think in order to make careful decisions, and even when we refrain from making one, we are making a decision. The choice to do nothing. And then the fact that we don't know the future prompts us to guess it, theoretically, with our Bayesian brains, in order to try to influence it. As you can see, as humans, we are in a disadvantaged position of which we are not responsible for. Moreover, how does Oxenberg explain what happened to Charles Whitman according to his worldview? Whitman was a model citizen who loved his family until one day, out of the blue, he went on a killing spree, murdering family members and strangers. Before the police shot him to death, he had written a note which was found in his pocket. He said that he knew there was something wrong with him because he was experiencing dark thoughts and urges he never felt before, and an overwhelming compulsion to kill. He expressed that he knew the cops would kill him eventually and urged the coroner to perform an autopsy to find out what was wrong with him. They found that he had a growing brain tumour, pushing against his amygdala. It is easy to see why one would conclude that Whitman was as much a victim of his own biology gone awry as the victims who were slaughtered. So, having said what I've said so far, the reason we often agonize over our choices is due to the fact that we don't know what the future brings. This fact does not in any way, shape or form render determinism mute, nor the illusion of free will for that matter. The agony only implies that we fret unfavourable future outcomes or events not going the way we want them to, which makes us beholden to our wishes and what we aim for. Where is the freedom in all of this? You also can't help how you feel about situations. You just feel what you feel because it flares up in your mind. You don't choose to be angry or sad or depressed. We also don't have the option to remain happy for the rest of our lives. If we did, psychotherapists would be out of their job. And people wouldn't need cognitive behavioral therapies, prescribed mindfulness and over-the-counter or prescribed drugs to mitigate anxiety and depression. It would be nice if we had a brain button for happiness, right? So you don't have to disregard personal experience at all as a necessary and unavoidable corollary of adopting determinism. When we watch a movie, we can feel vicariously anxious for a character in danger. We can agonize over a protagonist's possible choices, and yet we do not control their fictional decision making, let alone the plot determined by the script. We might experience anxiety and agonize over what a character should and shouldn't do because we merely don't know how the narrative will unfold. And our feelings become more pronounced when we are engrossed in the film, even more so when one of its qualities happens to be prolonged suspense. We also shouldn't discount a theory just because we find it personally problematic on the basis that it appears to lack justification for moral values, which Oxenberg seems to do in part. If you have moral responsibility, aren't you expected to behave a certain way according to social mores? After all, it is in the interests of everybody involved that you behave. One could also argue that hard determinism if adopted worldwide, will make people less judgmental if nobody can ultimately be blamed or praised for their actions. We can incarcerate the Jeffrey Dahmers of the world, but we would ultimately not assign any blame to them, for they are not responsible for their psychopathic tendencies and overall nature. We could even say that Adolf Hitler couldn't help but be himself and remain consistent with what we observe about reality's events. It doesn't mean that people are in the same category as inanimate objects or elements that wreak havoc, such as tornadoes, as Oxenberg claims determinism does. But I think here he mistakes it for materialism. An antisocial individual who is disruptive and chaotic isn't the same as a tornado for a number of reasons, including a crucial one that gets to the crux of my counter-argument. People have an inner witness to what happens around them, as well as the urges that drive them. The tornado has no inner life, unless, of course, panpsychism is true, which I don't think it is, and neither me nor Roxenberg argue for it. But so what if a theory ostensibly diminishes morality? Whether a theory reinforces morality as something with real substance or just a valuable social construct tells us nothing about whether it's true or not. The truth might hurt, but I'd rather know it. I don't care about whether it enables me to preserve my dignity or not, which Oxenberg thinks a theory should be able to do. Apparently. I don't know, maybe he should clarify on this point. If I am ultimately not deserving of praise for giving up cigarettes when I did and not when I wanted to, on my first try, because the required mental states with the right impulses eluded me, I won't lose any sleep over it. I'm not here to cherry pick from a number of theories in order to inflate my ego or make myself feel comfortable. I want the truth. So I will push back against every claim that human mammals make. Claudio is well aware of the fact that I have pushed back against determinism in the face of Bell collaboration tests involving people making binary choices instead of random number generators. Evidence, after all, points away from superdeterminism. But what concerns me here is the immediate human experience on a classical level of reality and whether or not it qualifies as including free will. If this allays your frustrations with determinism, just know that even though such a view ostensibly strips life itself of all meaning in its emphasis that there are no objective moral values, just remember that people subjectively differ in what they value. Something Oxenberg seems to forget. You can still derive meaning from everything that you are witnessing, despite having no say about how you might feel towards certain situations. The most antisocial of us certainly see it differently and don't experience that love for our fellow human beings. It is their nature to be chaotic and unrestrained by empathy or consequences when they decide to take a life, as in the case of murderers or serial killers. Oxenberg argued that determinism takes away responsibility, but nobody can even be responsible for being wrong or right. If the resources for experimentation here on Earth are limited and knowledge is scarce compared to what we could know about the universe, how can we blame scientists for being wrong when they have tried their best to formulate a theory of everything with what's available? And how can we praise a scientist who demonstrates himself to be right about something when he unexpectedly experienced an insight in a dream that led to the correct conclusion? Did they choose to have eureka moments? Of course not. Where is free will in all of this? My friend Claudia Soprano argues from the premise of being absolutely sure of libertarian free will, which I think is jumping the gun, but he is unable to falsify in the idealist model the lingering possibility of and sense of a sense of determinism once we understand that we don't freely choose what we end up deciding upon. When an observed chain of events happening in the medium of mind, whose occurrences logically and stringently follow from one another, and which we can predict with the concept and theory of cause and effect, which we witness without having any control over or power to break it. What I'm saying is that we cannot will the annulment of the laws of physics to happen. We do not have that freedom. We do not have that freedom. We have it in a lucid dream because we can cause with our personal minds the oniric chain of events to cease to make sense and violate what we would expect in waking life. We can experience disjointed scenes in dreams, knowing that one thing wouldn't normally follow from another. If lucid, we know them to be oniric non sequiturs. In waking life, this degree of freedom isn't available. So what does it mean to have free will? Claudio brings up tentative examples, but they don't prove free will in my opinion. He mentions the fact that people want their partners at first and might not want them anymore after some time, whilst neglecting the fact that wants have reasons beyond one's power. There is a reason why you wouldn't want your partner anymore. Something felt that you didn't decide to feel about your partner. It's not just conditions, it's influence in your mind determining action. Otherwise, people wouldn't say things like, I wish I didn't have to make this decision, but you gave me no choice. If we don't choose our wants, then we don't have free will. As Oxenberg admitted when he said to me that we do not choose our wants, but we can choose how to respond to them. Then all that remains, Richard, is to ask the question against your free will intuitions about the why behind the choice made about what you did not choose in the first place. How you respond to the wants or urges is inexorably tied to what you did not author in your mind, and your choice of response on whether to act on it or not upon closer and deeper inspection will depend on certain reasons that came to mind. For example, if you hear noises outside and you want to know what the commotion is all about, but you happen to be meditating and have 5 minutes left until the alarm goes off as a cue to end the session, you might decide to ignore it because you swore to yourself that you would not allow yourself to be distracted no matter what. Or you might decide you'll make an exception this time because you feel like you can resume meditation after looking out the window. As you can see, there are always reasons behind actions. You didn't know how you would feel about a situation until something, an urge and reason, was felt in your mind. The base of reality, consciousness, what you are, merely illuminates what is unfolding. It doesn't have to create the waking world it perceives because it has already been created. It can just witness the unfolding of events. So, either my definition of free will differs from Claudio's, or we simply disagree on the ontic relationship between the origins of the will and subsequent action. In Claudio's case, even if he loves grapefruit, but he chooses something else, there is always a reason behind that action. It could be that he wants to try something else, or he just wants to try to prove a point against my counter-argument, in which case it still wouldn't be an instance of free will, as he couldn't help himself but to retort against my pushback. There is always a reason why you might forego what you love. That reason to not go for grapefruit is something that presents itself in your mind willy-nilly. Hence why, when you say to someone, I love grapefruit, but I'm not going to pick it this time. Someone might ask you, why not? And you will say, I feel like trying something else. That feeling, which you did not choose, just like you didn't choose who you love, determined your subsequent action. Now, usually, people find reasons for choosing what they do. One can say that those reasons determine their actions. In this sense, it is perfectly fine to say that there's a will, but it's not free of its preceding justifications. This is what people mean when they say there is no free will. But where there's a will, there's a way. And a will can be the impetus that frees us from undesirable situations when we do something about our plights. We can make choices to free ourselves and it feels liberating, but we still can't label this type of will as free because the wish to extricate oneself from an unpleasant situation was determined by the unpleasantness and discomfort that one felt, which was somewhat overbearing. Hence the reason why people say, I had no choice but to do something about it. So we always do things towards well-being, comfort, reward, happiness, and if we are not suicidal due to repressive states beyond our control, we do it for survival. But we might choose to reframe our negative experiences with a positive spin, and you might say this proves free will. But even the reframing is an action taken to mitigate unpleasantness or to extricate oneself from perceived negativity, as this one is counterproductive. So we are always moving towards something. We are never at rest. The ultimate soteriology urges us to become still in the present moment and find acceptance with the status quo, but perhaps not before wisely exhausting a proactive Stoic approach in the face of adversity. In Buddhism, salvation is to free oneself from desire, the source of suffering in the world of samsara, a world that means wandering as well as cyclic change. But even the act of seeking salvation is driven by a desire that we can't help but have, as the journey inescapably begins from an egoistic standpoint, a position where you are clearly not satisfied and not free from desire, which only makes me balk at the assumption of libertarianism even more. There are people with impulsive behaviours and bad habits that they wish they didn't have. There are people who find it hard to control their temper and seek anger management. If you talk to them about free will, they won't know what you are talking about. It will sound like fantasy. I have taken on board the binary scenario Claudia Soprano has described in order to demonstrate the reality of free will, which sounds compelling on the surface but fails to falsify determinism once you pick it apart. I am also yet to see an explanation for what happened to Charles Whitman from his libertarian perspective. Now, we can define libertarian free will, but by what it's not. It's not determined, therefore free of influence. But it's also not random, because randomness isn't evidence of free will. It is only an abstraction, a concept born out of the notion of a series of events not having any detectable patterns. Random number generators do this, and they are still determined because they are programmed to break patterns that might be detected by human minds. Presenting someone with a binary choice ab initio is already prompting people to make a choice, which they will either make because they feel pressured to do so in trying to defend their beliefs, or avoid it because they might be bored with the subject. They don't know how they will act until you present them with the choice of picking between two numbers. People often say that they are not sure about a future commitment. I don't know. I'll see how I feel when the time comes. Like they are waiting for something to guide them. So if free will is free from determination and randomness, how do you make a choice that avoids both? If there is nothing influencing you, how do you avoid making a random choice? How do you make an unguided choice? The number that comes to mind is the one you will go for in Claudia's numerically binary scenario, which is not concrete evidence of free will, and the reasons why it came to you are mysterious. You don't really choose, you only think you do. There's a difference. In my opinion, if Claudio paid close attention to his experience, he would notice that he didn't freely choose to engage in a debate about free will on Facebook. He felt compelled to do so due to hang-ups and reservations about determinism being peddled with idealism. He felt a need to disseminate what he believes is a valid refutation of hard determinism because he finds it problematic. In fact, he can't help but find it problematic, which contradicts his worldview on this matter and lends credit to Castro's statement that people can't help but make the choices they make due to their very nature, who they are, which they didn't author in the first place. Claudio should sincerely ask himself if he could have refrained from posting counter-arguments on Facebook despite a strong urge to do so. Could he really have done things differently despite his strong mental reservations, or could he? Because I didn't quit smoking when I wanted to, it took me a few tries. It was a war of competing urges inside my head, of pros and cons and a lot of hesitation and uncertainty and not knowing what to do before I finally found myself in the right state of mind to go through with it. Claudia Soprano's explanation for this is that I was beholden to conditions and my own psychological makeup. But these are factors that are beyond my control, especially my very nature, which negate freedom. They negate freedom because they are constraints and limitations, and then he provided me with a link about behaviours being shaped by environmental factors rather than cognitive processes, which constitutes the theory of behaviourism. But the article was devoid of any expression or examples of free will. There were examples of people and animals having a will, but it's not free due to being conditioned. Maybe Claudia can elaborate more on this. I don't know. Maybe I'm not seeing what he wants me to see. On top of that, on top of the conditions, behaviorism posits that cognitive processes are redundant when it comes to action, which ironically appears to contradict his view. A decision that isn't based on anything, if such a thing is possible, is one that is allegedly made without any rhyme or reason, one that the decision maker would have to justify by saying, when questioned about it, because I wanted to. But what you want isn't something that you control. A want entails desiring, and it is clearly a compulsion. And if the allegedly free-willed decision-maker claims to not know why he or she decided in a particular way, then he or she is either admitting to not recalling why, or not having enough introspection, or betraying irrationality, randomness, or both, which would be a choice in itself that would require explanation. Randomness is not freedom. You are not free to speak gibberish for the rest of your life because you know there would be social repercussions and a massive incentive against it. If I dared you to do it, you would have to introspect to see if you would be willing to subject yourself to such a social ordeal, because you would immediately recognize that it would test you. You might even decide that you need time to think about it, the result of preliminary deliberation in your mind. You could try to do it to tentatively prove the a priori assumption that free will exists, but doing so would only be evidence of more determination, because my dare and your drive to demonstrate that you are correct would be its causal precedent, or the origins of such an enterprise. In other words, it seems quite apparent that the will we possess comes about out of necessity. I also detect a deep confusion with libertarians in that way, in that they often reinforce the duality of observer and observed. But there are types of meditation in traditions like Dzogchen where such a dichotomy disappears, and there is only a distinct sense that only the process of observation remains, an insight into how consciousness is intrinsically empty but possessing a luminous clarity. We have to remember, as idealists, that monism is non-duality. It is absolutely true that the reality is that there are many observers and what is observed isn't always observing, no doubt. But what all observers have in common is the ability to observe. Every observer, at their core, so to speak, is the same. Pure consciousness. On that level, we are all the same phenomenon. Here's a liberating thought. Try to go from I feel pain to there is pain. It's liberating, like being engrossed in a movie and forgetting about yourself. Your sense of self is diminished. There is no one to whom pain is hurting. Why hurt yourself? It's just pain existing as a qualitative experience in its own right. There is experience. This word is enough to beget perspectives of itself. The monk who set himself alight wasn't thinking, I'm on fire. He probably thought, there is burning. Or probably didn't think much about the sensation at all. From experience, it is normal to ask, what is experienced and who is experiencing? But experience is consciousness, a natural witness. It doesn't require a predicator, and it isn't founded on anything extra. It creates the experiencer as a limited perspective, such as a finite sentient being, and the illusion of what's experienced, the forms. The self with a small s, the earthly personality, is transient. The core of who we truly are is consciousness stripped of all of that. After being engrossed in watching a good movie and having your sense of self diminished, imagine that you pop to the shops and on the way you encounter a stranger glaring at you. Your sense of self would be augmented in contrast to your earlier cinematic experience. It would be reified again, because the appearance of a menacing stranger would make you focus on yourself as a person, and you would have thoughts along the lines of, why is he looking at me? Am I in danger? What should I do? And so forth. Creating a narrative of self included in imagined scenarios unfolding and involving possible danger in the future. Notice how this would prompt subsequent behavior on your part, forcing you to be prudent. The lack of free will in this example is glaringly obvious. Richard Oxenberg betrayed a non sequitur when he said that if we can conceptualize and talk about free will, it must exist. The way I see it is that the concept of free will impels us to discuss it, not necessarily true free will itself. It's like being aware that consciousness exists and this awareness causes us to talk about consciousness, it refutes epiphenomenalism. I could also quip, as Christopher Hitchens once did when asked if there is free will, and I quote, "We have free will because we don't have a choice," unquote. I told Oxenberg that we can conceive of fire-breathing dragons and flying pigs, but this doesn't mean that they exist. I couldn't believe his reply on Facebook when he said that fire-breathing dragons and flying pigs are imaginatively constructed from things with which we have experience: fire, breathing, serpents, pigs, birds, etc., before proceeding to rhetorically ask me, what experiences would our idea of free will be constructed from? I couldn't believe that a man of his caliber could be that fallacious. So I explained that the concept of freedom and the concept of will can be put together to form a new concept that doesn't necessarily exist apart from our imagination. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm not saying that's how free will emerged as a concept in the human mind, but it's possible to emerge that way. Just because two concepts exist separately doesn't mean their conceptualized merge exists beyond abstraction. Yes, birds fly and exhibit wings. Wings exist. Flying is possible for some creatures. Pigs exist. All these things exist in the world, but I've never seen a winged pig flying in the waking world. Besides weird hybrids that I might witness in dreams, as far as I'm aware, flying pigs are absent on Earth. Am I wrong? I think it's time to move from this topic and return to discussing idealistic monism, as I believe I've pretty much said all I wanted to say about the notion of absolute free agency. Absolutely free agency. Maybe me, Claudia Soprano and Richard Oxenberg disagree more on semantics, or perhaps I'm wrong and just not seeing what's right in front of me in terms of free will being an ontological primitive. Maybe I'm unjustified in saying that the will is constrained by conditioning, something that my friend Claudio opposes. Stephen Wallard wrote a beautiful article about this topic, and he separated will from desire in the case of human beings as we became more rational than animals in evolution. Although Kastrup would say, in his naturalist way of thinking, that even mind at large cannot help what it does or wills due to its very nature. The article on the Hermetic order of 21st century idealists certainly makes it seem superfluous to say that one had no other choice but to will what one wills, because otherwise it would imply that one didn't have the choice available to go against one's own will, which wouldn't make much sense. In fact, that's exactly what I've been doing here, and perhaps I'm wrong for doing so. But my stance really is ultimately, I don't know what the truth is about free will. So I'm not jumping the gun and express certainty about the ontic state of affairs. I mean, do you feel like you have free will? If you do, then you have it. If you feel it, it's real for you. It's real enough. The philosopher John Searle spoke about the striking differences between robots and human minds. I recall reading his book, The Mystery of Consciousness, years ago, when I was still a materialist, and he argued that brains are unlike computers because the latter cannot go beyond syntax, whereas the former includes meaning somehow. He also seemed to disagree with determinism in seminars, from what I can remember. Maybe the difference between having and not having free will lies in distinctions made between people and machines or computers. Could free will be inextricable from minds? Is consciousness and free will two ontological primitives combined? We certainly know that consciousness is real no matter what the likes of Daniel Dennett say. Consciousness can't be an illusion. Consciousness is not an illusion. An illusion has to be perceived by a conscious observer who detects that something isn't quite what it seems. An illusion necessitates consciousness to exist. Therefore, consciousness is not reducible to an illusion. It makes no sense to say that we are not conscious, we only seem like we are. Usually, when we are dealing with things other than consciousness, such as mistaking a rope for a snake, which happens in India a lot, we see that an illusion isn't something that doesn't exist. An illusion is merely something that isn't what it seems. But if we say that consciousness is an illusion, then inevitably we are saying that it doesn't exist because the seeming has to be the reality. To say that consciousness doesn't exist contradicts experiential evidence. Dennett's illusionism is an eliminativist perspective, and its utter absurdity. Free will, on the other hand, could be an illusion. Did I choose something freely, or could I not have chosen otherwise in hindsight? A robot can certainly be programmed to give the appearance of sentience to a human mind and even exude the illusion of free will. You might say I'm undecided on the matter, and that's fine by me. I certainly can't choose my agnosticism, it chooses me, as it were. After all, do we have ideas or do ideas have us? We can decide whether an idea is good or not, but we could also ask, what drove us to conclude that an idea is worthy or not? If a presented idea appears to be bad, this isn't us deciding it's bad, because its appearance is a revelation. It surprises us. I'm either compelled by an argument or I'm not. By caring about the truth, my caring about the truth is contingent on my nature and rules out both direct and indirect doxastic voluntarism, the view that we have control over our beliefs. I sincerely do not believe that. I don't believe that we can control what we believe. We don't choose what to believe in. We are either compelled by an argument or we're not. I simply can't get past the semantic implications carried by the concept of free will, which is why I am reluctant to commit to libertarianism or incompatibilism. I do flat out reject compatibilism, though. Determinism seems congruous with my experience and ostensible comprehension of the world, but it also has its philosophical problems, like requiring, intuitively speaking, a prime mover outside a closed system in order to flick the first domino, as it were. But then again, what reasons does the prime mover, if such a thing exists, have to kickstart everything? And would those reasons be the cause of its inclination to move as the first act towards creating worlds and sentient beings? In this hypothetical scenario, the prime mover is certainly free to create worlds with apparent cause and effect, but in another sense, perhaps it couldn't have done otherwise because it is in its nature to act and couldn't refrain from exploring its potential. Maybe the ground of being, mind at large, is beyond these concepts, and narrowed, spatiotemporally localized consciousness can view the unfolding of events as it pleases. Maybe, against human logic and intuitions, it is both and neither. One thing I am certain of, I don't know. My urge to settle this once and for all is pending. Psychedelics, which can reveal to us new ways of thinking about reality, certainly expose how narrow and constrained our mental default mode is, and how limited and blunt our normative ratiocination is. Darwinism itself doesn't explain why people devote so much time and assign so much value to behaviours that do not confer any survival advantage, such as our appreciation for music and artistic pursuits. As Richard Oxenberg pointed out, and he has a point, I think this is his strongest argument for free will, as we seem to freely choose to engage in such practices. Again, I urge you to check out his article about evolution and how it doesn't explain the drive to survive. Perhaps, and the struggle that we have all experienced to survive throughout evolution. Every creature that has ever existed has exhibited this drive to survive. Perhaps there is a divine will as an ontological primitive behind our impulses. Perhaps there is validity to the expression that man fell from grace, the grace of God, by embarking on the knowledge enterprise. Perhaps we, as mind at large, disassociated from the whole to become localized parts, and in doing so we forgot our true nature, falling from grace, to put it poetically. Adi Shankara, an early Middle Ages Vedic scholar who provided commentary on the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, defined what's truly real in quasi-Platonic terms using the criteria of dependence and persistence. To Shankara, real is that which does not change its nature, so the ground of existence is the only reality. Those things which do change are unreal or illusory and make an appearance in Brahman. In other words, something which persists is more real than what is transient. He provides the clay pot analogy where the clay represents Brahman, the essence of existence which never changes, and the clay gives rise to forms which may be named. The shapes we can create with clay can be labelled as lumps, pots, plates, etc. in the creative process. These objects represent what's unreal because they are illusory, nothing but abstractions referring to transient forms. In the end, there is only clay. The clay persists through causation and cannot be negated. It is more real than any forms it adopts. Shankara concludes that the metaphysical ground possesses more reality than the grounded effect. The effect is wholly reducible to its causal ground, and therefore the effect is not different from its ground. From this reasoning, which states that Brahman is the ultimate and only reality, we can see that Shankara was an eloquent expounder of Advaita Vedanta, non-dualism, because his philosophy points to monism, whilst also describing a metaphysical mereology where the universe, composed of objects that include space and time, is a derivative of Brahman, the infinite, eternal, and divine consciousness as the ground of existence. Now, I need to make this next point very clear about our reality. An illusion is not something that doesn't exist, as I've said before. It is a phenomenon in perception which isn't what it seems. So right here, we can see that the one thing that cannot be an illusion is consciousness itself. I've heard intelligent people like Daniel Dennett claim that consciousness must be some kind of illusion without realizing the absurdity of what they proffer. An illusion is entirely contingent on a conscious observer to confirm that a phenomenon is illusory. If someone claims that consciousness is an illusion, or you know, who or what is phenomenal consciousness being illusory to? More consciousness? Another conscious observer? You see how consciousness cannot be apprehended in such terms. The problem gets worse for materialists when they assume that some kind of dualism is true, because they assume a dualism is true where a postulated reality that exists independently of mind and which nobody can perceive directly somehow generates a conscious observer as an illusion. So Shankara solves many problems. Shankara posits monism, whereas materialists like Daniel Dennett, as you can see, they point to some kind of dualism, but then they try to get rid of this dualism because it causes problems, and they try to get rid of it by claiming that only unconscious matter exists and that mind must be some kind of illusion, and that also causes problems. It gets worse when it comes to consciousness. When physicalists try to claim that it is an illusion, they are really saying you are not really conscious. It only seems like you are, which is tantamount to saying consciousness doesn't really exist. It only seems like it does. I hope by now you can see this absurdity. You, consciousness, the one thing you can be absolutely sure of, don't exist. There is only unconscious matter. This is the eliminativist claim. Illusionism, when it comes to the subject of consciousness, is eliminativism. It can't be any other way. Of course, the physicalist creed is so prevalent that we are all guilty of using language to differentiate between ourselves and the rest of the world that is commonly shared. But the distinction that we are really making is between our personal minds and mind at large as a source. When mind is restricted and localized to a human form, it is mostly disconnected from the unbounded mind. It's a holarchy. Right now, we are both the parts and the whole. All you have is qualia, qualitative experiences. This is the only reality. The illusion is that there is a reality outside mind. Materialists succumb to the illusion of out there. They then believe that this external world cannot be directly perceived. They say you perceive a replica generated by your brain, and guess what? The replica is far more colourful and qualitatively real than the supposedly real thing out there. When you ask them, well, what does reality really look like? They are forced to say, and I paraphrase, to whom? The real thing doesn't look like anything. It's not even solid. Colours don't exist out there. Sounds don't really exist out there. Particles are only invisible waves, waves of what we don't know. Atoms are mostly empty space. Even their nuclei is composed of bundles of invisible energy, force fields pushing a certain way, but we don't know what's pushing. It's like a Cheshire cat grinning. And moreover, now we know local realism is false, as a number of massless quanta exceeding Bell's limit, below which hidden variables could be salvaged, behave as though the space-time fabric doesn't really exist between them, as we have seen with refined experiments with entanglement. What is out there is more akin to mathematical equations, and we still don't know what brings the equations to life. We know it seemed like the real world we're describing, which gives rise to us, is practically nondescript, and definitely not as rich as some of the afterlife realms described by religious traditions, but we expect you to believe it. This is the doctrine of materialism in a nutshell. The claim in idealism is not that reality doesn't exist, by the way. The claim is that reality does exist, but not in the way that we have been led to believe. The claim is that it's all mind. It's materialism that claims that the world we perceive is entirely in our heads. But idealism claims that the world isn't in our heads. The world includes us. We are in the world, and it's rich in terms of perception. The claim is that the universe is ultimately composed of qualitative experiences as part of a rich and diverse mental construct. And this universe isn't the only possible scenario in mind. There are, most likely, other mental worlds of the larger mind, which, as humans, we can't even fathom. Science is very useful and certainly helps us to navigate in this reality. But a scientist has no more of a monopoly over metaphysics than you and I do. Empirical observations don't conclude that materialism is true. In fact, the evidence is overwhelmingly suggestive of metaphysical idealism. A scientist is like a kid really good at playing a video game, but the kid has no idea about the coding, the programming, and the electronics behind it. But the kid can certainly intuit that there is a wider reality behind and beyond the pixels on the interface. The core of existence is pure, unadulterated consciousness. It is irreducible, immaterial, indestructible, eternal, formless, and certainly not nothing, even when empty of its content or divorced from conceptual reality. It tries to define itself by what it's not. It tries to get away from itself. It has a creative principle, and hence why its formless nature creates the illusion of forms and multiple dimensions. It creates illusions of disassociation, and the one can become many. But it is the ultimate reality. There is only consciousness in the end. The rest is just a complex mentation or mental processes within it. Some people might be tempted to call consciousness God. After all, it is said that God's name translates to I am that I am. I am fine with this application. I'm fine with the application of the word, but I mostly tend to refrain from using it in case it is mistaken for the omnipotent and judgmental creator in the Abrahamic narrative, about which I am an atheist. But I still remember reading God's Debris by Scott Adams and how eerie the book was. Adams prefaces the story, which is a philosophical fiction, by stating that it doesn't necessarily hold the same beliefs as the characters, albeit in some places by coincidence, as he claims, but doesn't specify. The fictional story then conveys a kind of monist pandeism. The protagonist is a young atheist who encounters a wise old man, and they discuss many things about the world, including philosophical conundrums, paradoxes, and even the weirdness of quantum mechanics, including theories about the nature of reality. Eventually, the old man tells the protagonist about stages, which he calls levels, that those who seek knowledge and wisdom go through in life. The old man says that there are 5 levels, where the first level describes an age of innocence and self-awareness, the second where one accepts authority and forms a belief system, the third entails the realization that some beliefs have to be wrong and not all can be right due to contradictions. And the fourth one entails the development of skepticism and the adoption of the scientific method. This is where the young atheist is at. But then, the old man tells him about level 5. This level is what the wise one calls the avatar level. At this level, you understand that the human mind is a delusion-generating machine and that science is another belief system, albeit a useful one. He then proceeds to inform the young protagonist that the final level entails not being an atheist anymore. He tells the atheist that before the universe came to be, there was only God, who was apparently omnipotent and almost omniscient, because he didn't know the answer to one question: can I self-destruct? This calls into question his omnipotence and immortality. If he fails to kill himself, then he is not omnipotent, but he is eternal and becomes omniscient by virtue of answering his own question. If he succeeds in killing himself, then he is omnipotent, but he is not eternal, and his last moments of fading away might still entail an omniscient realization. So God decides to find out, and voila, the Big Bang takes place. He blew himself to smithereens of probabilities, hence the probabilistic framework of quantum physics, and the key question is currently being answered. The young atheist then asks the wise old man, "Is God conscious?" "Yes," comes the reply, "through me and you." This is only a philosophical fiction, of course, but it certainly gave me an eerie feeling when I first read it in my late teens. I don't necessarily think it was anything like that which gave rise to a Big Bang, but I do wonder if the mind at large explores all possible scenarios and different finite perspectives where it can contemplate its wider self, or the notion of its own demise as a human being. So it deliberately, or perhaps unwittingly, forgets its true nature through illusions and delusions that it acquires through disassociated and spatio-temporally localized consciousness. It can adopt disparate avatars with contradicting or contrasting views and perspectives. For instance, a conscious observer could have a strong sense of libertarian free will, while another could be certain that hard determinism is true. Just as some theists, just as some are theists and others are atheists, some are teleologists and others are nihilists, and some are materialists and others are idealists. But then again, perhaps there is no exploration and there is a holarchy going on where the top mind is truly omniscient and in a divine apprehension of an infinitude of realities in mind, including worlds that we can't even possibly fathom as human beings. And there is no such thing as exploration or becoming per se, and no teleology, especially if the mind at large transcends space and time, which would mean that every mental construct describing the evolution and histories of universes are already laid out from a vantage point beyond 4 dimensions, the 4 dimensions that we perceive as human beings. There are some brilliant ideas being disseminated out there by people like Robert Edward Grant on time as an illusion, destiny and free will. Richard Oxenberg also has an amazing article on why evolutionary theory contradicts materialism, which was published on Kastrup's Essentia Foundation. Excuse me. And this argument seems to salvage teleology, actually. Oxenberg highlights the contradiction between epiphenomenalism in materialism and the fact that subjective states do seem to affect behavior in evolutionary biology. He also points out that the desire to survive is not explained by Darwinian evolution, let alone how the subjective can emerge from the material. I really urge everyone to read it because I can never do it justice. I will also be delving into Panentheism, as Stephen Wallard made it sound more fascinating than I ever imagined. Do check out his amazing Facebook group, the Hermetic Order of 21st Century Idealists, by the way. It's an amazing community of very interesting people. And I think I'm done for now. I'm going to leave you here with a quote from George Eliot. Adventure is not outside man, it is within. This is one of my favourite quotes, not just as an idealist, but also as a lucid dreamer.